The voice from space. On the night of May 23, 1961, in a converted truck parked in the hills outside Turin, Italy, two brothers were listening. Achille and Giovanni Judica-Cordiglia were in their early 20s, amateur radio enthusiasts who had built their own listening equipment with salvaged components and extraordinary ingenuity. Their setup, which they called Torre Bert after the location of their makeshift antenna tower, had been tracking Soviet space transmission since 1957, when Sputnik's beeping signal became the most famous radio transmission in human history. They had intercepted Sputnik. They had intercepted transmissions from lunar probes. They had tracked, as best they could with civilian equipment, the signals of the Soviet space program as it pushed farther and farther into the unknown. On the night of May 23, 1961, they recorded something different. A woman's voice, speaking in Russian. The recording has been analyzed many times in the decades since, and the words, as far as linguists and Russian speakers have been able to determine, describe a spacecraft in difficulty, heat increasing, sensors indicating re-entry conditions, something wrong. The voice is calm at first, then increasingly urgent. Then, the recording ends. The Soviet Union, 6 weeks earlier, had announced that Yuri Gagarin had become the first human being to travel to space. The space race was at its most intense. And two Italian brothers claimed to have recorded a Soviet female cosmonaut dying during re-entry, her death unacknowledged, her mission unannounced, her name never given. The Soviets denied everything. The recording was dismissed. The brothers were called frauds, fantasists, attention seekers. But the question their recording raised has never been definitively answered. Did the Soviet Union send people into space before Gagarin, before the world was watching, in secret tests whose failures were covered up and whose victims were erased from history? Tonight, I want to take you into that question, not to answer it definitively, because it cannot be definitively answered with the information currently available, but to examine the evidence honestly, to understand the context in which the claim was made, and to sit with what the Soviet space program's history of secrecy actually tells us about what might have been hidden. Let's begin. Achille and Giovanni Judica-Cordiglia were not professionals. They were enthusiastic amateurs, young men who had built their listening station from components they gathered wherever they could, who had taught themselves the technical skills required to track radio transmissions from space, who were doing something that no civilian organization in Italy was doing at the time. Their Torre Bert station began operating in the late 1950s, and from its beginning it was producing results that attracted attention. They tracked Sputnik's descent and claimed to have heard its final transmissions before it re-entered the atmosphere. They tracked American space missions as well as Soviet ones. They maintained detailed records of what they heard and when. Their most famous recordings, made between 1960 and 1964, claimed to capture Soviet space transmissions that went beyond anything the Soviet Union officially acknowledged. In addition to the May 1961 recording of what they identified as a female cosmonaut in distress, they claimed to have recorded, in November 1960, a Soviet cosmonaut transmitting a distress signal as his spacecraft drifted away from Earth, his life support failing. They claimed to have recorded, in February 1961, the sounds of a human heartbeat and breathing from a spacecraft that was tumbling out of control. The recordings were presented to scientific and journalistic organizations, examined by various experts, and assessed inconsistently. Some analysts found them credible. Others found technical reasons to doubt them. The Soviet Union dismissed them entirely. The brothers maintained their claims for the rest of their lives. Neither ever recanted. Whether their recordings were genuine intercepts of real Soviet transmissions, misidentified noise or interference interpreted as meaningful signals, or deliberate fabrications is a question that has not been conclusively resolved. To evaluate the lost cosmonaut claims, you need to understand the extraordinary secrecy that surrounded the Soviet space program in the late 1950s and early 1960s. The Soviet space program was not a civilian scientific enterprise in the way that NASA would present itself. It was a military and propaganda operation, run by the Soviet military-industrial complex, directed by a chief designer, Sergei Korolev, whose name was not publicly known during his lifetime. The Soviets did not announce space missions in advance. They announced successes after they occurred, and failures, if they acknowledged them at all, were buried in official silence. This secrecy extended to personnel. The cosmonauts who trained for Soviet space missions were military officers whose identities were classified. The selection and training processes were not public. The size of the cosmonaut corps, the specific missions being prepared, the technical details of the spacecraft, all of this was state secret. The secrecy was also applied retrospectively. When cosmonauts were removed from the program, for political reasons, for health reasons, for failures, they were erased from the official record. Photographs were altered to remove their faces. Official histories were written that did not include their names. This practice of erasure is documented and indisputable. Several cosmonauts who trained for early Soviet space missions have been identified by subsequent historians as having been airbrushed out of official photographs. They existed, they trained, they were prepared for missions, and then they were removed from the history. The existence of this documented erasure is the most important context for evaluating the lost cosmonaut claims. If the Soviets erased cosmonauts who were removed from the program for ordinary reasons, they were certainly capable of erasing cosmonauts who died in accidents. The Soviet space program's history of selective disclosure makes the assessment of lost cosmonaut claims genuinely difficult. What the Soviets admitted, publicly and on the record, during the space race was carefully curated. They announced Sputnik after it launched. They announced Gagarin's flight after he had safely returned. They announced each successful mission as it concluded. They presented an image of a space program that was advancing from success to success, with no failures, no accidents, no deaths. This image was false. The Soviet space program had significant failures, accidents, and deaths throughout its history. Several were eventually acknowledged, decades later. The Nedelin catastrophe of 1960, an explosion during a rocket launch preparation that killed approximately 100 people, including the marshal responsible for strategic rocket forces, was suppressed for nearly 30 years. The deaths of cosmonauts Vladimir Komarov in 1967 and Georgy Dobrovolsky, Viktor Patsayev, and Vladislav Volkov in 1971 were eventually disclosed, but only because they occurred after the space race was fully public and concealment was no longer possible. The question is whether the pattern of concealment that is documented for these later events also applied to earlier, unknown events, whether the Soviets concealed not just the circumstances of deaths but the existence of missions and the identities of their victims. Several individuals have been identified by historians and journalists as members of the early Soviet cosmonaut training program who were subsequently erased from the official record. The most prominently discussed is Valentin Bondarenko, who died in March 1961, 6 weeks before Gagarin's flight, in a fire in a pressure chamber during ground training. Bondarenko's death was a genuine accident. He was wearing a medical sensor attached with alcohol-soaked cotton, and when he removed the sensor and tossed the cotton, it landed on a hot plate and ignited. He died of his burns within hours. Bondarenko's death was suppressed for 25 years. It was not acknowledged until 1986. During that time, official Soviet accounts of the early cosmonaut program, including group photographs that showed the cosmonauts together, were altered to remove him. He was not erased because he died in space. He was erased because his death, even in a ground training accident, was an embarrassment that the Soviet propaganda machine did not want to acknowledge. His erasure demonstrates that the Soviet program was willing and able to remove a person from the historical record. Other cosmonauts who were removed from the training program for health or disciplinary reasons were similarly erased from photographs and official accounts, even though they had not died. The specific claim of the lost cosmonaut theory is that the Soviet Union conducted crewed space missions before Gagarin's flight on April 12, 1961, missions that resulted in deaths or disappearances that were subsequently covered up. The evidence for this specific claim is limited and contested. The Soviets did conduct extensive test flights of the Vostok spacecraft before Gagarin's mission. Several of these flights carried animals, dogs, in particular, and several of the dogs died. The flights also carried test dummies to evaluate the re-entry systems. One of these test flights, on March 25, 1961, just 18 days before Gagarin's flight, carried a dog named Zvezdoka and a dummy named Ivan Ivanovich. The existence of Ivan Ivanovich as a test dummy has led to speculation: was a real cosmonaut also flown on some of these missions? The Vostok capsule was designed for human occupancy. The life support systems were functional. Was it possible that the Soviets sent cosmonauts on test flights before Gagarin, and that some of those cosmonauts did not survive? No documentary evidence has been found to confirm this. The Soviet archives that have been partially opened since the collapse of the USSR have not produced evidence of pre-Gagarin crewed missions. Former Soviet space officials who have spoken publicly about the program have denied that such missions occurred. The political stakes of the Soviet space program in the late 1950s and early 1960s were enormous, and understanding them is essential to evaluating how far the Soviets might have gone in concealing failures. Sputnik's launch in 1957 had been a profound shock to American confidence. The idea that the Soviet Union, widely perceived in the West as technologically backward, had placed a satellite in orbit before the United States had done so was politically devastating. The space race that followed was not just a scientific competition, it was an ideological battle, a demonstration to the world of the comparative merits of the Soviet and American systems. In this context, a failed crewed space mission, a cosmonaut dying in space, or being lost, or being disabled, would have been catastrophic for Soviet propaganda. The pressure to present the program as an unbroken series of successes was intense. The institutional culture that encouraged concealment was powerful. If a cosmonaut had died in an early mission, the incentive to cover it up was enormous. The technical capability to cover it up existed. The institutional practices of secrecy that enabled such a cover-up were already in place. This does not prove that a cover-up occurred. But it establishes that the conditions for a cover-up were present, and that dismissing the possibility out of hand requires more certainty about Soviet behavior than the historical record justifies. The recording ends. The woman's voice, or whatever it was, is gone. The equipment records static. The brothers look at each other in the dark of the truck in the hills outside Turin, and they know that they have heard something, but they do not know what. In Part 2, we go deeper into the space race, into the specific history of Soviet secrecy, into the documented cases of erasure and concealment, into the full context in which the lost cosmonaut claims were made. Rest here. Somewhere above the atmosphere, the stars are very bright and very silent. The space race and its secrets. The space race was not what it appeared to be. It appeared, to the world that watched it, like a scientific competition, two great powers racing to achieve technological firsts, pushing human capability to its limits, exploring the frontier of space in the name of progress and national prestige. The rockets and the capsules and the astronauts and the cosmonauts were presented as the embodiment of human aspiration, the next great adventure of our species. This presentation was not entirely false. The achievements were genuine. The scientists and engineers who designed the rockets and the spacecraft were doing real science. The men and women who flew were genuinely brave, genuinely skilled, genuinely at the frontier of human experience. But the space race was also a propaganda operation on both sides, a carefully managed presentation of achievement and concealment of failure, in which the nations involved showed the world what served their interests and hid what did not. The gap between the presentation and the reality was not small, and understanding that gap is essential for evaluating any claim about what might have been hidden. The most extraordinary fact about the Soviet space program is that its architect was unknown to the world during his lifetime. Sergei Pavlovich Korolev was the chief designer of the Soviet space program from its inception in the late 1940s until his death in 1966. He designed Sputnik. He designed the rockets that launched it. He designed the Vostok capsule that Gagarin flew. He was the driving intelligence behind the most successful run of space achievements in the history of human spaceflight. His name was classified. He was referred to publicly only as the chief designer. His identity was kept secret to protect him from potential Western assassination and to prevent the West from understanding the organizational structure of the Soviet program. When he died in 1966, of a routine surgical procedure complicated by colon cancer, in circumstances that suggested inadequate care, his name was revealed publicly for the first time, in his obituary. The man who had done more than anyone else to initiate the space age was unknown to the world until he was dead. The secrecy around Korolev reflects the broader culture of the Soviet space program, an institution that was simultaneously pursuing achievements for public display and conducting its actual operations entirely behind closed doors, with the identities of its key figures, the details of its missions, and the facts of its failures all classified. The Soviet space program killed a number of dogs in the course of developing its human spaceflight capability, and the treatment of these animals, and the disclosure of their fates, is instructive about the program's relationship with truth. The most famous case is Laika, the dog launched on Sputnik 2 in November 1957. The Soviet Union announced that Laika had survived in orbit for several days before dying peacefully when her oxygen ran out, a humane ending to a historic mission. This was not true. Laika died within hours of launch, from overheating caused by a thermal control malfunction. The Soviets knew this. They did not disclose it for 45 years. The truth was finally revealed in 2002, by Russian space scientists speaking at a space conference. The deliberate misrepresentation of Laika's fate, maintained for decades, across the entire period of the space race and beyond, is not a trivial example. It demonstrates that the Soviet space program was willing to lie about specific, documented facts related to the fate of living beings in space, and that it was capable of maintaining those lies for very long periods. If the program lied about a dog for 45 years, it was clearly capable of lying about a human being. Several serious accidents in the Soviet space program were suppressed or concealed during the space race and only acknowledged years or decades later. The Nedelin catastrophe of October 1960, already mentioned, was the most deadly. Marshal Mitrofan Nedelin, the commander of Soviet strategic rocket forces, was present at the launch pad of an Ard-16 rocket when it exploded during preparation for a test launch. Approximately 100 people were killed, including Nedelin. The Soviet government announced that Nedelin had died in a plane crash. The truth was suppressed until 1989. In March 1961, 6 weeks before Gagarin's flight, the cosmonaut Valentin Bondarenko died in the pressure chamber fire described earlier. His death was suppressed until 1986. In April 1967, Vladimir Komarov died when his Soyuz 1 spacecraft's parachutes failed during re-entry. This death was acknowledged because it occurred after the space race was fully public. But recordings of Komarov's final transmissions, including what some have described as him weeping and cursing the people who had sent him up in a spacecraft he believed was fatally flawed, were not released until decades later. These documented cases establish a clear pattern. The Soviet space program suppressed information about accidents and deaths when disclosure would have been politically embarrassing, for as long as suppression was possible. The most suggestive evidence for the lost cosmonaut theory, beyond the Judica-Cordiglia recordings, is the documented existence of cosmonauts who trained for early Soviet missions and then disappeared from the historical record. The original cosmonaut group, selected in 1960, consisted of 20 men. Of these 20, only some flew in space. Several were removed from the program for various reasons: health problems, disciplinary issues, accidents during training. Their removal was typically accompanied by their erasure from official photographs and official histories. Grigory Nelyub was one of the most prominent. He was part of the original cosmonaut selection, was reportedly in the top 3 candidates for the first human spaceflight, potentially ahead of Gagarin at some point in the selection process, and was removed from the program in 1963 following a disciplinary incident. He was subsequently erased from official group photographs of the cosmonaut corps. He died in 1966, struck by a train, in circumstances that may or may not have been accidental. Dmitry Zykin was another. Selected in 1960, he was eventually grounded for health reasons and removed from the program. Like others, his removal was accompanied by his disappearance from official accounts. These cases do not prove that cosmonauts died in space and were covered up. They prove that the Soviet program was willing and able to erase people from the historical record, and that this erasure was applied to cosmonauts who were removed from the program for reasons that had nothing to do with space fatalities. The timeline of the Vostok program, the spacecraft that Gagarin flew and that carried subsequent Soviet cosmonauts, is relevant to the lost cosmonaut question. The Vostok capsule was developed and tested extensively in the years before Gagarin's flight. Between May 1960 and March 1961, at least 7 Vostok test flights were conducted. These flights carried animal passengers, test dummies, and equipment for evaluating the life support and re-entry systems. The final test flight before Gagarin's mission, the flight of March 25, 1961, carrying the dogs Zvezdoka and the dummy Ivan Ivanovich, was the last in a series that had progressively demonstrated the system's readiness for human flight. By that point, the Soviets were confident enough in the system to send Gagarin up 18 days later. The question is whether any of those test flights carried human passengers who were not announced. The answer, based on the available evidence, is probably not. The technical challenges of life support and re-entry were being evaluated sequentially, and the dummy flights suggest that human passengers were not yet being risked. But probably not is not the same as definitely not, and the absence of documentary evidence from Soviet archives is not the same as evidence of absence. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, significant portions of the Soviet space program's archives became accessible to historians and researchers. The opening of the archives was incomplete and selective, not everything was declassified, and access was uneven. But what was released shed significant new light on the program's history. The archives confirmed the Nedelin catastrophe, the death of Bondarenko, and numerous other incidents that had been suppressed. They provided new detail about the program's development and its internal debates. They revealed the true scale of the program's failures and near misses. What the archives did not reveal was documentary evidence of pre-Gagarin crewed missions that resulted in deaths or disappearances. No mission files. No medical records of cosmonauts lost in space. No internal correspondence acknowledging the existence of such missions. This absence of documentary evidence has been used by those who deny the lost cosmonaut claims as the definitive refutation. If such missions had occurred, the archives should contain evidence of them. The counter-argument is that the archives were selectively opened, that the most sensitive documents were not released, or were destroyed before they could be released. This argument cannot be proven or refuted without access to documents that remain classified or that may no longer exist. The archives tell us what they tell us. They confirm the secrecy, the erasure, the documented accidents. They do not confirm the specific claims of the lost cosmonaut theory. In Part 3, we examine the Judica-Cordiglia recordings in detail, the specific recordings that have been the center of the controversy for 60 years. Rest here. Somewhere in Moscow, the archives wait. Some of them are open. Some are not. The evidence. There are 9 recordings. That is the number of transmissions that the Judica-Cordiglia brothers claim to have intercepted between 1960 and 1964 that suggested the existence of Soviet space missions that were never officially acknowledged. 9 recordings, made on magnetic tape, preserved and examined by various experts over the following decades. The recordings have been analyzed by acoustic engineers, by linguists, by radio experts, by Soviet and Russian space officials. The assessments have varied. Some experts have found them credible. Others have found technical reasons to doubt them. Still others have declined to give a definitive assessment. The most important thing to understand about the recordings is this: their authenticity. The question of whether they were genuine radio transmissions from Soviet spacecraft is not the same as their interpretation. A recording could be a genuine transmission and still not mean what the brothers claimed it meant. A recording could be interpreted differently by different listeners. The context that would allow definitive interpretation, knowing what missions were flying, knowing the frequencies being used, knowing who was speaking and why, is precisely the context that Soviet secrecy denied. Let me take you through the most significant recordings and what can and cannot be said about them. The first recording that the brothers claimed was significant dates from November 28, 1960. In this recording, the brothers claimed to have captured a Soviet spacecraft transmitting a distress signal, a slow, rhythmic signal that they interpreted as a cosmonaut's heartbeat, transmitted by a spacecraft that was drifting away from Earth rather than returning. The interpretation of this recording as a human heartbeat from a spacecraft is the most speculative of the brothers' claims. A slow, rhythmic radio signal can have many natural and artificial sources. The identification of such a signal as a human heartbeat requires assumptions about the transmission source and the signal characteristics that go well beyond what the recording itself can establish. No Soviet mission has been identified that corresponds to the date and the claimed distress signal. The window of the recording was a period of significant Soviet space activity, Sputnik program and early lunar missions, and various signals from these programs could, in principle, have been misidentified. The November 1960 recording is the weakest of the brothers' claims, and most serious analysts have treated it as the least credible. In February 1961, the brothers claimed to have recorded a Soviet spacecraft transmitting sounds that they interpreted as a human heartbeat and breathing, sounds suggesting a living person aboard a spacecraft that was tumbling out of control. This recording is more discussed than the November 1961, partly because February 1961 is closer to Gagarin's April flight, and partly because the sounds on the recording are more interpretable as biological in origin. The Soviets did conduct space missions in this period. The Sputnik 7 and Sputnik 8 missions in February 1961 were Venus probe launches. A failed Vostok test mission, carrying a dummy, occurred in December 1960. None of these missions would explain a recording of human breathing. Linguistic analysis of any voice elements in the February recording has been inconclusive. Some analysts have heard Russian words. Others have heard nothing intelligible. The recording quality is poor enough that definitive analysis is not possible. The May 23, 1961 recording is the most famous and the most discussed. It is the one that has attracted the most serious analysis and that has proven most resistant to simple dismissal. The recording contains what sounds, to most listeners who have heard it, like a woman speaking in Russian. The words, as interpreted by Russian language analysts, appear to describe a spacecraft experiencing high temperatures and re-entry conditions. The voice is described as calm but increasingly urgent. The Soviets did not fly a female cosmonaut until Valentina Tereshkova's mission in June 1963, 2 years after the recording. If the recording is genuine, it suggests a female cosmonaut in a spacecraft experiencing a fatal re-entry in May 1961, 6 weeks after Gagarin's historic flight. The recording has been analyzed by multiple parties with varying results. Some analysts have found the voice credible as a genuine Russian-speaking woman describing spacecraft conditions. Others have argued that the recording is too degraded to support specific word identification. Others have suggested that the recording could be a terrestrial source, a radio transmission of some kind that was misidentified. No definitive technical analysis has either confirmed or refuted the recording as a genuine space transmission. The technical assessment of the Judica-Cordiglia recordings is complicated by several factors that make definitive conclusions difficult. First, the recordings were made on consumer-grade magnetic tape with equipment that, however ingeniously constructed, did not meet the standards of professional monitoring equipment. The recording quality is poor, and degradation over 60 years of storage has made analysis more difficult. Second, the brothers did not maintain complete logs of all the transmissions they monitored, only the ones they considered significant were preserved and catalogued. This means that there is no way to assess the recordings in the context of the full range of signals being received at the time, which would be necessary to evaluate whether the specific recordings were anomalous. Third, the Soviet and Russian space authorities who would have the best ability to assess whether the recordings correspond to actual missions have not provided detailed technical responses. Their denials have been categorical rather than technical. Fourth, the frequencies and signal characteristics of the recordings would need to be compared to the known frequencies and characteristics of Soviet space transmissions to evaluate whether they are consistent with genuine transmissions from Soviet spacecraft. This comparison has been attempted by various analysts but has not produced definitive results. The Soviet Union denied the Judica-Cordiglia recordings immediately and categorically. Russian space authorities have maintained that denial to the present day. The denials have taken the form of assertions rather than technical rebuttals. Soviet and Russian officials have said that no such missions occurred, that the recordings are fabrications, that the brothers were frauds or fantasists. They have not provided the kind of detailed technical analysis that would demonstrate, specifically, why the recordings could not be genuine Soviet transmissions. The absence of detailed technical rebuttal could mean several things. It could mean that the authorities are confident enough in the categorical denial that they see no need to engage with the specifics. It could mean that a detailed technical rebuttal would require disclosing information about Soviet transmission frequencies and mission protocols that remains classified. Or it could mean that a detailed technical rebuttal would be difficult to construct. The denials are consistent with the proposition that the recordings are genuine Soviet transmissions of missions that were suppressed, because if such missions occurred and were covered up, denial would be the expected response. They are also consistent with the proposition that the recordings are not genuine, because if they are fabrications or misidentifications, denial would also be the expected response. The denials, in other words, do not help us distinguish between the two possibilities. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union and the partial opening of the archives, several things about the early Soviet space program have been confirmed that were previously denied. The death of Bondarenko in March 1961, 6 weeks before Gagarin's flight, is now confirmed. The Nedeling catastrophe is confirmed. The true fate of Laika is confirmed. The existence of cosmonauts who were erased from official photographs is confirmed. None of these confirmed facts directly support the lost cosmonaut theory. They do not confirm that cosmonauts were lost in space before Gagarin. But they confirm that the Soviet space program was capable of exactly the kind of concealment that the theory requires, and that its denials of embarrassing facts were not reliable. The specific claim that the Soviet Union flew cosmonauts in secret missions before Gagarin and covered up their death remains unconfirmed by documentary evidence. It also remains unrefuted by documentary evidence. The archives that have been opened do not contain evidence of such missions, but the archives that remain closed, and the documents that may have been destroyed, are not accessible for examination. The recordings are there. 9 of them, preserved on magnetic tape in an archive in Italy, analyzed by various experts over 60 years, producing conclusions that range from credible to fabricated and that have never converged on certainty. In Part 4, we ask what the lost cosmonaut claims mean, regardless of whether they are true, and what they tell us about the Cold War, about secrecy, and about what we are willing to believe about the things governments hide. Rest here. The tape is still. Somewhere, a signal is still traveling through space, if there was ever a signal. What was hidden? There are things we know were hidden. The death of Valentin Bondarenko. The Nedeling catastrophe. The true fate of Laika. The identities of the cosmonauts who were erased from official photographs. The extent of Soviet launch failures in the early space program. All of these were hidden, for varying periods, with varying degrees of success. These confirmed concealments are not the lost cosmonaut claims. They do not establish that cosmonauts died in secret missions before Gagarin. But they establish something important, that the Soviet space program was an institution with a demonstrated capacity and willingness to hide significant facts about its operations, including facts about deaths. This established capacity for concealment is the foundation on which the lost cosmonaut theory rests. Not proof, the theory requires more than the capacity for concealment to be true, but the necessary condition. A space program that never concealed anything could not have concealed dead cosmonauts. A space program that demonstrably concealed multiple significant events could, in principle, have concealed this one too. For the lost cosmonaut theory to be true in its strongest form, that the Soviets launched crewed missions before Gagarin that resulted in deaths, and that these missions and deaths were completely suppressed, several things would need to be true simultaneously. The missions would need to have been conducted with the knowledge restricted to a very small number of people, a circle small enough that no leaks occurred over the 60-plus years since. The physical evidence of the missions, technical documentation, medical records, communications logs, the spacecraft themselves, would need to have been destroyed or concealed so thoroughly that the partial opening of the Soviet archives has not revealed it. The people who knew about the missions, the engineers, the technicians, the mission controllers, the physicians, would need to have maintained their silence through the collapse of the Soviet Union, through the period of glasnost and openness, through the decades since when many former Soviet officials have spoken about previously classified programs. These requirements are not impossible to satisfy. Small, highly classified programs with restricted knowledge did exist in the Soviet system. Documents were destroyed. People maintained silence about classified programs they had participated in. But the requirements are demanding, and the absence of any corroborating witness, any person who was involved in such a mission and has spoken about it, is the most significant obstacle to the theory's credibility. The most compelling evidence against the lost cosmonaut theory is the silence of potential witnesses. If the Soviet Union had conducted crewed space missions before Gagarin that resulted in deaths, the number of people who would have known is large. Spacecraft construction involves hundreds of engineers and technicians. Mission control requires teams of operators. Medical support for cosmonauts involves physicians and nurses. Ground tracking requires station operators across multiple sites. All of these people would have known, or would have been in a position to know, that such missions occurred. In the 60-plus years since, many of them have died, but many others have survived. Former Soviet space engineers and officials have spoken extensively about the program since the late 1980s, about its history, its failures, its classified programs. None of them has confirmed the lost cosmonaut theory with specific, verifiable information. Some former Soviet space officials have categorically denied it. None has said, yes, I was there, this happened. The argument that all these potential witnesses have maintained silence is not impossible. There are classified programs in every country whose participants have maintained silence for decades. But it is a demanding assumption, particularly given the number of people who would have been involved and the political changes that have occurred in Russia since 1991. The lost cosmonaut theory needs to be understood in the context of the broader culture of Cold War conspiracy thinking that it emerged from. The space race was a period of intense propaganda on both sides, and both sides accused the other of concealing failures and fabricating successes. The Soviet Union accused NASA of faking the moon landings, a claim that has no credibility but that has proven remarkably durable in certain communities. American commentators accused the Soviets of concealing failures, some of which accusations turned out to be correct, as in the Nedelin catastrophe, and some of which remain unverified. The lost cosmonaut theory is not obviously in the same category as moon landing denial. It rests on evidence, the recordings, the documented erasure of cosmonauts, the confirmed capacity for concealment, that gives it more substance than pure conspiracy theory. But it shares with conspiracy theories a tendency to interpret absence of evidence as evidence of concealment rather than as evidence of absence. The honest assessment is, we do not know. The evidence is insufficient to confirm the theory, and the absence of documentary evidence is insufficient to definitively refute it. The most that can be said is that the conditions for such a cover-up existed, that the Soviet program was capable of it, and that the available evidence does not resolve the question. One question that bears on the lost cosmonaut theory is what Yuri Gagarin himself knew about the program's history before his flight. Gagarin was a member of the original Cosmonaut Corps from 1960. He trained alongside the men who were subsequently removed from the program. He was present in the closed world of the cosmonaut training facility at Star City for the year before his flight. If pre-Gagarin crewed missions had occurred and resulted in deaths, Gagarin would almost certainly have known, not from official documentation, perhaps, but from the institutional knowledge of the cosmonaut community, the informal conversations and the shared understanding of what had happened before. Gagarin never publicly disclosed any knowledge of pre-flight crewed missions. He died in 1968, in a training aircraft crash that is itself the subject of some conspiracy speculation, without having spoken about any such knowledge. His silence is consistent with both possibilities. If such missions occurred, he may have maintained the secrecy that the program required. If they did not occur, his silence on the subject is simply the absence of any information to disclose. Whatever the Judica-Cordiglia recordings actually captured, whether they are genuine Soviet space transmissions, terrestrial signals misidentified as space transmissions, or fabrications, they have a meaning beyond their specific content. They represent the attempt of two young men, working with equipment they had built themselves, to pierce the secrecy of one of the most closed institutions in the world. They represent the impulse, which is fundamentally human and fundamentally decent, to know what is actually happening, to not accept the official account without question, to listen for the signals that the powerful would prefer go unheard. The Cold War was a period in which the powerful on both sides concealed enormous amounts from the people they governed and from each other. The Judica-Cordiglia brothers were part of a larger culture of monitoring and listening, amateur operators who pointed their antennae at the sky and tried to hear what the governments were not saying. Some of what they heard was probably genuine. Some was probably misidentified. Some may have been fabricated, consciously or unconsciously, by the desire to find something significant. The recordings exist in the space between these possibilities, and that space is where the history of the Cold War lives. The truck is parked in the hills outside Turin. The brothers are listening. The tape is running. Outside, the Italian night is cold and clear, and above the atmosphere. The stars are indifferent to what is happening in the basements of space agencies and the committee rooms of governments and the makeshift listening stations of amateur operators who want to know the truth. The recordings were made. They have been analyzed. They have not been confirmed or refuted. In Moscow, archives are open and archives are closed. The people who would have known are mostly dead. The spacecraft that flew those missions, if they flew, are debris now, in orbit or burned up on re-entry, incapable of testimony. We do not know if the Soviet Union sent people into space before Gagarin and covered up their deaths. We know that the Soviet Union was capable of exactly this kind of concealment. We know that it did conceal other deaths and other failures. We know that the recordings exist and that their origin is not definitively established. The space race produced some of the greatest human achievements in history. It also produced some of the most systematic institutional deception in the history of science. Both of these things are true, and they are not separate, they are part of the same story. Somewhere in the space between what was announced and what actually happened, there may be people whose names were never spoken, whose deaths were never acknowledged, who went into space and did not come back and were erased from the record as if they had never existed. Or there may not be. The sky keeps its own record, and it does not share it with us. Good night.